Welcome to our first annual plan workshop. We've got another one planned next week as well. This is going to be live streamed, and you will just need to make sure that you use your microphones because the video won't show our faces, but we'll hear you speak. So just make sure that you're using your microphones because the slideshow will be the main part in the live stream. We have an apology from Councillor Everest today. We have a new format, I guess, going forward for our budget. So this is new to what we normally do. This is your chance, councillors, to ask lots of questions, and if we'll get as far as we get today, we'll be back next Tuesday, and if there's additional time needed, then we can look into that. We have Tony, Mark, Helen and Gordon here, so guess you will kick us off, and councillors, please put your light on if you have a question throughout the presentation. Thanks. Hand over to you, Tony, or Hamish, did you want to start?
No, I think the team's got this, so the presentation can start. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Mayor Liz. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 26-27 Draft Budget Workshop. What you'll see that you've been provided with today on Stella, you'll see there's a cover memo that talks about the approach that we've taken to get to this point. In that memo, it also covers off the business cases that have made it through executive and those that have been included within the draft budgets and those that were unsuccessful, so you can see the detail on those. The successful ones, you'll find the detail of those sitting further down in the actual specific activities, but we'll cover those off as we go through the day today. So there are also on Stella, there are actually the 13 summary documents, the first one of which is talking about the whole of council, and that's what we will spend most of our time this morning, is talking about what the global picture looks like at the whole of council level. And then we can break those down further into the specific groups of activities such as drinking water, transportation, waste, recreation facilities, etc. Within each of those documents, we'll cover off what the structure looks like in terms of how it fits within the organisation, how it's funded. We'll give you an overview of what is changing based on the current draft budget that we've got right now compared to last year and compared to year 3 of the LTP. We'll cover off where the expenditure changes are happening in the operating and the capital side of things. We'll also talk about what the rating impact looks like and what's happening with the fees and charges for each respective area, so you can see where the levers are being pushed and pulled. We'll give you the actual budget information, so the spreadsheet with the numbers in it, and also there'll be the business cases included sort of for each chapter of the organisation's business. For that's where the decisions are able to be made on whether those business cases stay within the thinking or not. So today's approach is we want to take a little bit of a moment just to set the scene, just to remind ourselves where the LTP sits, how the annual plan fits within that side of things. We've got some key concepts just to come through, just to make sure that we're all coming at this with the same level of understanding of what the key information is leading into the budget. And then we'll talk about any context and assumptions that you need to be aware of that are driving some different changes through the budgets. We'll have a look at the summary of the whole of council, and then we'll review by activities. We're happy to take your questions along the way. And if we get right to the end today, it's around the next steps and you guys giving us an indication of if there's more information required or some amendments that you'd like to see.
I'd just like to clarify something so that members of the public understand that we only received the information 30 minutes ago. So if the councillors all seem a bit dumb when it comes to numbers because they've only just received a lot of information, we haven't had any time. And I feel for some of the newer councillors who, it's a new concept, you need a few days or weeks to absorb these numbers and understand them, so they've only had them for half an hour. So it's probably, if we're very silent today, that'll be why.
Through the chair, we acknowledge that. We're looking at this this is the start of the budget conversation with you, and we want to take the opportunity to make sure everybody's on the same page as we work through where the different changes may be, and happy to answer questions now. And of course, we've got the next workshop this time next week, and also if there's subsequent workshops needed, we will book them in and make it happen. So, point taken. Cool. So we're taking a team approach to this, as you can clearly see. We've all got different areas that we can explain in different ways. So I'm going to hand over to Mark now, who's just going to help set the scene of how the annual plan sits. And then when we get into the financial details, we'll hand it over to Gordon and Helen.
Good morning, everyone. So what is the annual plan? So essentially it's updating year 3 of the long-term plan. So it's not starting from scratch. It's building on what was already in that document and identifying, I guess, the main changes between that year and the annual plan 26-27 year. So you'll see there the purpose of the annual plan under the Local Government Act. Not about reinventing the wheel, about building on what's already there. So it's an exceptions-based planning approach, and as a result of that, you can look to consult if you think there's sort of significant issues that you want to consult with the public on. But again, that's focused around the differences to the year 3 of the annual plan, or if you choose to, you can obviously consult on anything associated with the annual plan. The usual timeframes apply, so we have to adopt it by 30th of June. And obviously we're moving into the next cycle of long-term planning, so any sort of long-term strategic planning we're looking to build into that process over the next 18 months. So this is our timetable as it stands at the moment. Workshop today, next week, and potentially a final one on the 25th, depending on how we go. As part of that, we'll look to get your guidance on whether or not you want to consult on the annual plan and provide you some advice around that. And aiming, I guess, to adopt, if you choose to consult, on the 25th of March and consult during the month of April, if that's going to happen. So again, looking towards the end of June to adopt the annual plan, depending on how the whole process goes. We're just going to talk about a few sort of key concepts just to help set the scene. You'll probably be fairly familiar with these, but obviously operating expenditure is the day-to-day expenditure of council, so it's all that stuff that we need to do to keep the operation running and make sure that everything works as it needs to, so it covers things like electricity, interest, chemicals and so on. Largely that's rates or funded through fees and charges, and then of course you've got capital expenditure, which is all the physical works on council activities broken down into renewals, increasing a level of service and growth. So generally a renewal is about replacing what's already, or renewing what's already there, such as resealing a road. Increasing a level of service might be building a higher level of service for a particular activity. So FOGO I guess is an example of that. And growth is where we're building a bigger facility to cater for increased need. Generally those sorts of activities are funded through loan, but there might be other sources that are also available to us, such as development contributions and sometimes grants from government. So these are the base assumptions that we've come up with at this point, in terms of the assumptions on which the annual plan is based. So you'll see that the draft has a 10.2% increase in it, based against LTP, which was at 11%. And again, there's an assumption there around interest costs, so assumed in the draft at 3.8, with the draft, the LTP assuming between 4.3 and 5. There's a few sort of overall debt limits that are set in the financial strategy that we have to meet, that are set out there, and obviously as part of that we aim to achieve a balanced budget. In terms of the 1% of rate, so that's essentially equates to 560% of overall cost.
Richard's got a question.
Does the interest cost assumption of 3.8, does that equate to what our advice through our external advisors are as to the year? Because there's a bit of talk in the media around how the interest rates are going to go up earlier than later.
I'm still working with Bancorp on that, so we have still been finalising what our drawdowns would need to be. So I will come back to you at the next meeting with that.
Councillor Cameron.
My question was the same essentially, and then if you go to the long-term plan, that 10 years, Have we varied the figures each year to 4.3 to 5, between 4.3 and 5, have we?
That was the range which was included as an assumption in the LTP. So
Okay.
we're at that point, we're assuming it would fit between that range.
Okay.
Hamish?
And just
Oh,
to
sorry.
clarify, and Helen or Gordon might just be able to confirm, but I think our current cost of capital is sitting at around 3.5%. So the assumption of 3.8 is made on the basis of interest rates perhaps being near the bottom, and a lift to a degree. So that's the context of the 3.8.
Carolyn, did you have another question?
I did, but I think Hamish should just
Okay.
answered it pretty much.
Got it.
So we just got to keep an eye on that, don't we? That's something else we should put on.
Yeah, light on it if you want anyone.
We need to put that on the board and keep an eye on that, because that could impact the outcome, couldn't it?
Okay, so just to clarify on the proposed rates increase, so that's the increase in council's rate take. So that's the amount of money that we're going to collect through rates. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to get a 10.2% increase. It's just the amount of money that we're going to collect through the rates that we collect for our various services. So I'm just going to pass on to Helen to talk us through some of the financial changes made to the overall budget.
Good morning, everybody. We have changed the way that we have been doing things in the budget this time. Not everything, but the things behind the scenes, the way that we're using the system, trying to make a smoother process and make the information more transparent in terms of what we present to you. From the get-go, we worked with a zero-based budget, so we didn't pre-populate the budget system with numbers from year 3 of the LTP. For the operational revenue and expenditure, we asked managers to work from the bottom up. How much do they need to deliver this service? Just noting that inflation, I was looking for the year 3 figure there, was 3.5 was budgeted in the LTP, so we didn't automatically apply that to any of the budgets. It was from a zero base. The rates contributors, so normally they are distributed to activities that receive the rates contributors, so just winding things back a step, the rates contributors are general council revenue, so revenue that isn't generally attributed to a specific activity. So some examples of that are the dividend that we receive from ACL. We get general interest from day-to-day investments. And there are other sources of just general revenue that come through the day-to-day business of council. And you'll see that later. We've got that on a separate slide and a separate component of the whole of council. What we are working to do is to automate how that revenue is pushed through to those activities, so the ones that receive it. So the numbers that you see in 2026 budget are reflective of last year's annual plan and so some of the activities like EA Networks, the library and so on, they actually do have the rates contributor for 2026. They don't have it for what we are working with at the moment for 2027. So we have captured that revenue. It's sitting in the activity called miscellaneous, and you will see a big number there, and we can point to it when we come to it. What we're wanting to do is automate how that money is distributed to the activities using the system, and we're close to getting it there. What we're trying to do is save essentially potentially a day or two's worth of work by hand to automate the process and get it in the right buckets accurately every time we make a change. So that's the rationale there.
Hamish?
Just following that.
Oh, your light's not on.
Sorry,
Yeah.
just following that, Helen, our practice is that the rates contributors offset rates that are paid by all ratepayers as opposed to targeted ratepayers. So where there's the general rate or the roading rate or the UAGC that is paid equally across the district, those are the areas where the contributors offset rates so that everyone benefits from that additional revenue rather than just a targeted rate area.
So we'll go into that in more depth when we look at the council summary. The debt, we've moved to recording debt at a project level, so we don't have the historical information at a project level, but going forward from 2026, so the current year that we're working in, and also recording it for 2027, we're going to record debt at a project level, so whenever we borrow for something, we will record that debt and know what the principal and interest costs and when that debt actually matures, so we can turn around and tell you when that debt has been paid off.
Councillor Cameron.
Will you apply that retrospectively, or is that too big a task?
It's too big a task to
Okay.
unpick what
So
was
for
borrowed.
how long do you anticipate before that becomes meaningful information with regards to historical debt? Like 3 years or 5 years, or like before we can look at activity?
A lot of the debt is fairly new.
Okay.
So we have the historical stuff we have lumped together, but we have gone back in the years. So we've been going, we traced it back to 2020 at an activity level, but not at a project level. So for the previous 5 years, we've got activity level debt. And
Okay.
then we'll move into project
Into
level.
project level, and then have
Yeah.
it drop down to, or drop up to the activity, so activity,
Yes.
FOGO, or
Absolutely.
whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you. And that is that a direction from the auditors, or is that just a direction you want to have for clarity, or is that a,
It's good practice that I'm used to working
Okay.
with.
thank you.
And in terms of the principal repayments against that debt too, so we're using a table approach. So by using a table approach, so that's, think of it like your home mortgage, you're paying interest and principal at the same time, and as you pay less interest as the debt declines, you pay more principal. That really aligns with the principle of intergenerational equity. And it means that you're not front loading your debt servicing costs when you do borrow for something. If you just pay 1/20th or 1/25th of your principal, you're actually front loading that cost to the ratepayers at the beginning. So shifting to this approach means that we're treating a fairer approach to servicing that debt. The overheads previously were all put into one line item against each of the activities. What we have done is split out what is a core overhead that is shared across the organisation, and what are those costs that we're using a bucket to capture. They're essentially direct costs of running the activity, but we're putting them into a bucket and pushing them out. So we've called those direct distributed costs. The purpose of doing that is to not blur what true overheads are within an activity, and to demonstrate the costs that would normally be classed as operating costs for the activity, but they're using this overhead type methodologies to push them out. So examples of that are, we use the bucket system that I referred to for parks administration. So for example, all of the parks employees and some of their operating costs all go into one cost centre. That was being classed as overheads and then pushed out to the respective activities. That is now being called direct distributed costs, and we've got more explanation in the council summary that shows you exactly what those cost centres are that are captured and then pushed out through the direct distributed cost, just to give you that understanding. We've applied that logic to both 2027 and 2026, so the numbers that you are looking at are comparable. And the depreciation, so this time you will see depreciation coming through, depreciation expense in the core reports that we present to you, but you will see a new line item called unfunded depreciation. So in some activities we are not fully funding depreciation, and I've got a few slides and a couple of slides down just to talk through some of the principles around that. It just gives you clarity about where we are fully funding depreciation, where we are not fully funding depreciation, and then where that depreciation money is actually going. So I'm hoping that that will be helpful for you as well.
Councillor Wilson.
Just a summary of some of those things. So I'll start at the top, the no funding of inflation in year 3, that will reduce costs, but that won't erode the expenditure value that we have in that year by not funding inflation not applied to a long-term plan. By not doing that in year 3, doesn't erode the spending ability of the money you have in that 3rd year.
No, because we've asked managers what it will cost to still deliver the same level of service.
So you could call that productivity increase. That's the only way you can.
In some instances, some activities, there are increases because we are maybe contractually obligated to apply an inflation adjustment. But as a general principle, when it comes to things like sundry expenditure or general operating costs, and people have just had $1,000 or something, that hasn't been automatically applied. So there's swings and roundabouts.
The table basis, what have we done in the past for paying off our loans?
It's been difficult to unpick the methodology. From what I've seen with the LT, well, for the annual plan, that was just paid on the basis of what was in the LTP. I think, from what I can see, it has just been, for example, 1/20th has been paid, so I understand it's been front-loaded.
That's quite a significant saving, or saving is not the right word. It's a quite a significant change if you're going to, because you have three options. You pay it a 20th, if you've set a 20th, you pay it a table mortgage, or you pay interest only, and it's closer to interest only in the first year than it is to a table mortgage, isn't it, quite significantly?
The historical stuff, though, is still, it's not going from the start, so it is, we have short-dated that, so it still has the same life. But yes, you will see that shift in some of the interest and principal numbers that you will see. But there have also been changes in things like interest rates and the borrowing that we've done as well. So it becomes a little bit blurred because there are multiple levers being pulled within the debt servicing.
And my last one is on depreciation. It's always been an easy way for councils that's been a criticism, to not depreciate assets quick enough. Therefore, when you go to replace them, you haven't got any money put aside. Are we doing that, or are you confident we're depreciating assets at the correct speed to be able to replace them like with like? I'm not saying improve them, replace them like with like going forward.
So this probably comes to the slides that I'm going to go through shortly, but depreciation is an expense, it's a book entry, so we're required to depreciate as in terms of what our principles and standards are, so depreciation doesn't impact on the funding or the cash that we require. What councils do play with is depreciation funding, so how much money do they set aside to pay for those renewals? We've seen in the water services plan that we aren't funding sufficient depreciation and we are front-loading the spend on those renewals. So the plan did work towards lifting the increase in funding depreciation, and you will see that come through in the budgets for those today, and I can talk you through those in terms of how that works with the real examples there. Some areas we are funding sufficient, but I think about Te Whare Whakatere in this building, and council made a decision to increase depreciation funding by 120,000 each year. So is that sufficient? Yes, it's a new building, but we also know there will be renewals required in the future. So it's very dependent on having really good asset management plans and understanding what your assets and your renewal program is. And that's a very big part of working through the long-term plan, to understand what our assets are and what the renewal program looks like, and to do a reset at least every 3 years on how much money we're setting aside for renewals to make sure there is enough there. Okay. So reserves, we've made some changes to the way that we present reserves to you as well. That's very much around the in and the out. So you're both seeing both sides of the reserve movements. And we've also got depreciation reserves, and you'll see the in and out of those as well. So you'll see how much is being funded and where that money is then being set aside into a reserve for the future, if the reserve doesn't require those funds in the current year. Capital expenditure as a starting point was based on year 3 of the long-term plan and the water services delivery plan year 2. There have been adjustments to those, and those are noted through each of the activity sheets. Depreciation, talked about funded and unfunded depreciation, and I've got some slides in a little bit to work through that as well. And the direct distributed costs. I'm just feeling that that's a bit of a double up. Yep. Okay.
So this is just another assumption. I'm pretty sure everyone's got the message on this one now. But so for water services within this draft budget, we have used the water service delivery plan as the basis for that. Remembering that the internal business unit, the implementation is going to be quite busy over the 26-27 year, with a go live date of 1 July 2027. The budget does reflect the water service delivery plan with some small exceptions in and around some CapEx projects. So we'll make sure that they're really clearly stated so you can see what's happening there when we get to those specific chapters.
Councillor Wilson.
Through the process, will you clearly identify and show so that the public can understand the change, the extra cost that's been attributed to the government's enforced water service delivery plan? Because that's, I think, understand it's one of our bigger increases. So the public want to really understand it, not just see it as part of the greater slush fund, you could say, of council. It needs to be identified out because that's out of our control almost.
Absolutely, we've got it really clearly laid out where the cost increases and where the rate increases are really driving from, and waters is a big part of that mix.
Hamish.
And we can confirm that the charge to the ratepayers for water services is exactly as per the proposal in the water services delivery plan that we consulted on and the government approved. So the level of rates for those connected to council water services is as per the indication in the water services delivery plan as already consulted on.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. With the water service delivery plan, we've got to ring fence all the debt and everything else for water. How difficult is that from what you've just said before, that, you know, our debt's just in one big pool and you're going to have to go deep diving to find out where that debt level's at for some of those things we may have borrowed money for, you know, 10 years ago? Is that going to be an easy process?
The debt is recorded at an activity level for the waters, so we do have transparency around what the total is. We just don't know at a project level.
Right.
This is my bit of education session around depreciation. I kind of have talked to it a little bit, but I'll try and go a little bit slower and do it again. So depreciation is a non-cash cost. It goes in your expenses. It's something that accountants are required to do for every organisation for different reasons. For us in terms of council, it just becomes a book entry that we don't necessarily need to raise rates for, but it's a cost that in our annual report, for example, we are required to account for, and auditors look at that number and make sure that we have the principles behind it and we are following those principles. In terms of why, as accountants, we record depreciation, it's a method of recognising the cost or the use of a portion of an asset over its life. Asset, generally speaking, does decline over the use of its life. And sometimes at the end of the life of that asset, you will dispose of it. Sometimes you may choose to renew it to bring it back to its its original condition. So that's why we account for depreciation. Renewal expenditure, you'll hear us refer to renewal expenditure or renewals or CapEx renewals. It's all the same thing. But renewals is the cash that we are required as a council to pay to bring that asset back up to its original level of service, or to replace an asset that we already have but it's at the end of its life. So for example, a pump, a stormwater pump, maybe at the end of its life we would go and replace the pump. That would be a renewal because it's an asset that we already have. We need to keep that pump. We need a pump to pump the water. We're going to go and replace it, so we renew the asset. Longer life assets, things like roads, we've still got a road there. It's still functional, but probably the the life or the quality of the surface on the road may decline. So over a number of years, depending on the road and the engineering around it, we would renew the road so that asset isn't fully written off, but it's the value of that asset would decline. We spend money, cash, to renew that asset, to bring it back up to the same level of service that it was when it was originally instated.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. When you're renewing that pump and at that time the decision's made, you know, there's been growth and so instead of putting the same pump back that did X, we need now one that does Y. That renewal pays for the X part and then the funding for the difference can come from some other sources.
Absolutely. So you can, I'll say, purchase, create, build an asset that can be all three categories. So when we talk about CapEx, we talk about growth. So your pump for your stormwater is servicing a bigger area of the population. You need a bigger pump. So that might be a portion of the asset's cost. A level of service, you might want it to move the stormwater faster so that it's not ponding as much. That cost in terms of the CapEx would be classified as level of service, and you're replacing the existing pump, so that's a renewal. So one asset can have all three components to it. Okay. In terms of classifying those assets, we do that to recognise the funding. So every time we purchase or create an asset, we look at the different components as to essentially who should pay, and that's where we talk about renewal funding or depreciation funding, and I apologise because I probably use those words interchangeably, but essentially depreciation funding, renewal funding, it's the same thing. That's the cash that we actually need to pay for the renewal expenditure or the CapEx renewals. So how much generally from rates, because that's generally where the funding source is, do we need year on year to pay for those CapEx renewals?
Councillor Cameron.
So in the renewal funding or the depreciation, is there a growth component based on the future of that item? You know, you mentioned before the wastewater or stormwater pump. Given that the town is growing, do you put a growth component in that, or is it actual based on what it was?
Depreciation is based on exactly what our assets are. So when we're looking at forecasting the depreciation for these budgets for 2027, we know what our expense was for 2025. We've looked at what new assets we would have on stream and what the depreciation expense should be for those new assets, and that forms the basis of what our 2027 depreciation expense budget is. And those assets could be growth, renewals, or level of service. Yeah. So depreciation itself isn't actually classified by those three different areas. It's just the spend for the CapEx, and therefore that triggers the funding source. So these are the numbers that I took from the LTP when I was doing some work last year, and there's some actual numbers there at the beginning as well. And what I'm really trying to show you is that depreciation expense, so that's the accounting entry, the non-cash entry, is not always a good proxy for what our renewal expenditure is. So the red line was the depreciation expense that was in the LTP, and the blue line was what our renewals expenditure was classified as. So if we funded, or cash funded, rate funded, our depreciation, that non-cash entry, that accounting entry, we'd actually end up over the 10-year period with surplus cash. So just remember this is on a 10-year basis. But you can see the blue line, we're not spending as much as what that depreciation expense was telling us. And this is at a whole of council level too. So activities are different. So when we actually do the work underneath, different activities have different cost needs and different depreciation expense and so on.
Councillor Wilson.
Can you just clarify to me that when you talk about renewal depreciation, that's replacing like with like. It's not improving it at all. And some people would call if you had a 1975 Toyota Corolla and you bought a new car, you could only afford to buy a 1975 Corolla, or could you upgrade to a modern one? So if that's or water, if you had a 200mm pipe, you could only put a 200mm pipe in. Even if the demand of the modern person, modern house demanded more, you would only be depreciating for that past usage or that past requirement.
Yeah.
So isn't that a risk going forward? Because then that'll mean that if you've only got renewals at that level, the public expectation will be higher than what it was in the past, because that's how things work. The new stuff you put in is always bigger and better than the last, because that's just how the world works. So we won't be depreciating. We are renewing it in a technical sense, but everything we do will actually have another component of cost to it that we won't have depreciated for.
Not everything, and this is a really blunt example that I'm trying to illustrate, and there are blurred lines and grey spaces in terms of how the numbers work through, because but if Three Waters came to you and we want to replace this 200mm pipe with a 500mm pipe, in terms of funding that, we would say based on the valuations, because when we get to our infrastructural assets, in terms of the depreciation expense, that goes through based on the valuation. But hopefully Three Waters would have, in their asset management plan, at least knew that they needed to replace a 200mm pipe, even if it was like for like. So we would have an updated cost of what replacing that 200mm pipe was. So we don't, when we're working out the renewals cost, we don't work it out based on what we originally paid for the 1975 Corolla. We work that out based on what it would cost today to replace that pipe. So if all things being equal, we would have set aside the right amount of funds to replace a 200mm pipe at today's costs, or when we're going to do that. And then yes, if we wanted to turn it into a 500mm pipe, that's an increased level of service, which in theory you would loan fund to pay for, because it's an increased level of service. Council can choose to make decisions outside of those rules. They're not legislative rules, they're not hard and fast, but it's a basic principle in terms of spreading costs to the right people as to who's getting benefit from those things.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. So what happens in this scenario where we've rated and we've sweated the asset because it hasn't needed replacing, because obviously when it needs it, you do it, but if it doesn't need it, there's, it doesn't happen. So you've rated this money and now we have this gap. What happens? What then happens?
Yep, and that's a really good example of, I think, where we are in the water space. So we are doing an awful lot of renewals. We are spending way more renewals than we are funding in terms of depreciation. We don't have depreciation reserves set aside because we haven't. It's a lever that councils have generally pulled over the last 20 years to keep rates down. They didn't see a need to set aside buckets of money for renewals that were there in 20 years' time. So no, we don't have reserves, depreciation reserves sitting there. We're also, we'll see it come through when we look at the waters, but the water services plan was approved on the basis of operating overdrawn reserves, and then those reserves are replenished because the expenditure is generally front-loaded. We keep paying depreciation funding at a similar level. We actually ramp it in the beginning, but then it stabilises, and those overdrawn reserves get cleared. So you are, in a business sense, I guess, borrowing or cash funding those renewals to be able to actually pay for them.
Hamish.
And I think of it too in terms of the depreciation, because it's an accounting entry, not a cash cost per se. The assumptions you make about depreciation become very important, and I'm sure some councils remember when the early work was done around water services with the previous government. There were some assumptions made about the life of the assets, i.e. the rate of depreciation, that were quite different to how most councils would regard the life of the assets. And in fact, I think the depreciation was over something like 40 years when many of the assets are still perfectly functioning at 70 and 80 years. So depending on the assumptions you make around depreciation will depend on the size of the depreciation number, and that's why it's often not matched with the renewal program or the cost, the funded cost because the asset goes longer than that, and the affordability flows from that.
Councillor Wilson.
On this scenario where we renew expenditure, in the blue line, will that not result in 2033, 2034, our debt, the council debt being higher because by having the red line, you're actually funding depreciation as you go, therefore you have more cash coming in effectively because it's a cost you've had to budget for, and therefore in the future you've had to borrow more. If your 200 mil pipe will need to be 300, just that's people flush the toilet more often, and that's just modern living has greater demands. Therefore, won't that mean that our debt will go up in time?
You would borrow more for the increased level of service, yes, but if you're setting aside renewals and you're not going to do that work for 20 years, then you're charging ratepayers for 20 years for something that they potentially don't benefit from in terms of that increased level of service and the change in pipe size.
Has Ashburton over the last 20 years done that, charged the ratepayers in advance, or has it been, because that's one of the criticisms of councils, that they haven't been charging enough for depreciation and they've sweated their assets down. Have we done that? Have we done that, or have we been, I always thought Ashburton had been reasonably good at funding its assets up front, sort of.
From what I can see, it's been funded year on year, so there are no significant depreciation reserves set aside. And depreciation funding, renewal funding, has been used to pay for debt servicing as well.
But we do have asset management plans in place for water that indicate the level of renewals that the network requires to keep the level of service at the same level. So we have tended to commit to the renewals program. We just haven't done it via a funded depreciation mechanism every year.
So this is just a quick example, and this was data out of our LTP as well, just to demonstrate that renewal expenditure isn't always even. So if we don't set aside funds sort of on a flat line or an average basis, you can end up with rating shocks. Because if you just rate fund your renewals year on year, depending on what your renewal program is, your rates can go up and down quite significantly, depending on how your renewal program falls.
Councillor Wilson.
Sorry to keep asking questions, but would it be fair to say that when you go out to 2033, 34, we don't know what we don't know? So if I look back 10 years ago, no one had any idea that so much, therefore you didn't know you had to fund it. So when you look at 10 years, because you don't know what you don't know, it's easy for the graph to drop off, but in reality the graph will probably go up because things will get tougher rather than easier.
Yep, I think it's very much a learning process. I've been in this business probably too long, and asset management planning gets better year on year. The introduction of infrastructure strategies, pushing that out to 30 years as well, has improved the data. The data that I've seen out of the water services team here is really, really good. It's probably the best I've seen in terms of asset planning in my experience. But you don't know what you don't know in terms of increased environmental standards. In theory, that should be level of service again. If the game changes, it's not a straight out renewal, but it would probably add some cost to it. But probably almost want to jump to the next slide, but the best way around this process is to look at what your average is on a longer term view as possible. I'll jump to, am I missing, I'm missing one. Bugger. Possibly. It's the stormwater one. We'll just see if we, yep, that one. That's right. That's there. Yep. Thank you. So this is real data as well, and in Waters they have got really good 50-year data. So this is a real example that I played with last year, and some of you will have seen this graph before when we looked at it for the last annual plan. But the blue bars are the renewal program and stormwater. So out of their asset management plans and the infrastructure strategy, they were able to tell me what the renewal program looked like. The red line just at the start was for the first 10 years of the LTP. That was the depreciation expense. If we funded depreciation in stormwater based on the depreciation expense, we were looking at needing $680,000 on average per annum to pay for that renewal. Sorry, we would have been funding $680,000 based on depreciation expense each year. Whereas if we did it on the basis of the blue line, so the green bars instead of the red line, we actually only needed $465,000 on average. This was taking a 50-year view. So what's our renewal program over 50 years? Average that out year on year. How much do we need to set aside? We needed to set aside $465,000 per annum. If we did it on the basis of the red line, how much is the depreciation expense, that book entry, going through our books? It was $680,000. So council made a conscious decision last annual plan to unfund or not fund some of the depreciation expense to reduce the rating impact for stormwater specifically. So if we put aside $465,000 a year based on that renewal program, put it away year on year, that's what your purple line is there. You can see that reserve fund is building while we're not really doing any renewals. Then when the renewals kick in, that reserve balance comes back to zero at the end of that 50-year period. But the best way to do this, because I wouldn't envisage that line, that purple line hitting back to zero, is to renew this life cycle view at least every 3 years. So every LTP, at least you would renew. What is the 50-year renewal program? How much do we need to set aside, and make sure that the renewals do align and that the money's being set aside. And that way you're keeping up to date with any inflation trends that are on there, the increased cost of renewing those assets as well, so that you don't end up with those rating shocks.
No questions on that? So is that, the stormwater example, is that different to, say, drinking water, wastewater?
Absolutely, yeah. So you've got very much front loading in the water and wastewater. So the green bars you would see very early on. The purple line you would see dip below zero because we're spending it up front. And then as we keep topping up the reserve, that straight line that you see across, that will bring the reserve balance back up and over again, and then we start capturing depreciation. So there's actually depreciation fund there for renewals.
Okay.
So just a bit of a recap. I've shown you with those graphs based on our real numbers from the LTP that renewal expenditure, it's lumpy and it's irregular, and we don't always know when something is going to need renewing because it might just break. But to take that average basis will avoid shocks to the rates when we do need to replace things. So funds set aside are useful because at some point an asset will need renewing. It supports the principle of intergenerational equity because people today are paying essentially the same amount as people in the past and people in the future as they're using those assets. So it spreads the cost across those different generations. And just in principle, councils fund depreciation to build reserves for future renewals, and that's generally based on our asset management plans, and it aligns with local government financial sustainability principles. So hopefully that was helpful and not too much.
Yeah, Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. So when we do a big project, and I suppose EA Networks was a classic one, and we treated depreciation as one lump sum, if you like, on the whole thing. and then we need to, after 10 years, replace some components like the air conditioning units. But as such, we hadn't depreciated the air conditioning units. We'd looked at a big pool. We've changed that system going forward. We're more like with this building, it's more broken down into components. Is that correct, the depreciation?
So what the property team are actually doing with the building is componentising the assets and getting good asset data and asset management plans, so they do know the life of what the assets are at a component level. So we will have better information for the next long-term plan about what that renewal program will look like.
Tony?
Okay, team, that's the Education 101 on annual plans. Depreciation, I expect you all to be experts now. That was a fabulous explanation. I'm learning a lot every time you talk me through things, Helen. What I'd like you to do now is on Stella, head into the annual plan budgets, and you're looking for the budget that's titled A, Whole of Council. This is the summary of the whole of council that we're going to work through now.
Everyone got that? 13 pages, that's right.
Okay. I'll wait till everyone's there.
Everyone all good? Yep. Yep.
Marvellous. So we've got 14 of these documents. This is the mothership document, so to speak. So what you'll see on the slide in front of you is we're about to talk about at that top level, that top box. But the other 13, they're sitting down at that second tier. So the recreation activities, for example, and then within that, we're talking about the library, Rokowhiria, and the EA Network Centre. So that just so you can understand how the concept of this is working today. So for this next section, we're going to talk at that whole of council level. And if you head into the document and head over to page 1, we're just going to work through section by section, explain what's happening, and then answer any questions along the way. And if there's something we don't know, we'll head away and go and find out and come back to you. So page 1, that's the headline.
Can I make a comment?
Yep.
It is very, very, very difficult. You've got hundreds of pages of stuff to be led through and actually make a comment on it. So I think to say we'll make comments, and you can't expect us to make a comment that's actually relevant when we haven't even read it yet. So, because you need time to absorb it and then come back to you with a comment. So I don't think you can't expect us to make all the comments that are relevant today to this. So once we've finished this, you can't say we've done that bit, because we haven't had time to look through it and come up with our questions.
And that's fair enough, and I guess this is a new format. We're going to go through it, and there will be hopefully ask questions along the way, but there is a chance to come back and review if needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So acknowledge the point, and if you think of comment / question, then you're free to now question it and get understanding. As you say, it's not necessarily going to be today that you will be ruling things in or out, but by the end of today you will have a much better understanding of what the budget is and how it's structured, given that it is different from previous times, and the budget process is planned to be over a number of workshops in order to get to the end point that we need to get to.
Councillor Cameron?
Two things. That's not our page 1. No. We've got a different you got a different presentation, have you, to us? Our page 1 is overall summary.
No, that's page 3.
Oh, well, yeah, but the other ones are just, indexed.
So we go straight in from that top page that you had, it goes into contents on page 2.
Oh,
And
sorry, go to the next page over, sorry.
And my next point is, or question, where's our board? Because I think the board's,
Right there.
oh, see you, good, so we can just write things on the board, otherwise
Yep.
we'll, because we're going to get responses, and I'm not trying to anticipate that or say, well, we'll talk about that later, or that's going to come up later, you know.
It
If we
will be
ask something,
noted.
they'll say, well, we can give you more detail when we get to it, you know, so I think we just need to keep an eye on that. I think that's fair comment, despite the smirks down there, and I think that's fair
Oh, there's
comment.
no smirk, sorry, no.
And
Wasn't there at all.
the presentation, on the screen is not just a repeat of what's on Stella.
No.
So this is how we're going to talk to you about what's on Stella.
Yeah.
So this refers to the information on page 1. It's not a mirror image of page 1.
Yeah, so we've got page 3 on Stella, which is one overall summary.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, Yeah.
This is describing it. For
describing it. Yeah.
Yes.
So we will pass over to who's going to go through this.
I'll do this first part. Okay. Apologies. We got ourselves in a tangle with the page numbers versus how it shows up on Stella. So we were using the page numbers off the actual physical document, not how it rolls through onto Stella. So there'll be 2 pages out on everything that's referred to on these slides. So just go 1 + 2 and you'll get to 3.
Yep.
Okay. So with the overall summary, as we've talked about earlier, we've got a total rate increase rate requirement of 10.2%. Under the first section on Stella, it shows you where it's landing within the general rates, the UAGC penalties, the targeted rates, and how that sits. But really it's 1.1 on Stella, which is what we're showing here on this slide, and this is where the key variances are sitting. So these are the drivers that are driving that rate increase. So you'll see FOGO and solid waste costs are up. The water services is having an impact. Council's budgeted contribution towards the second road, knowing that we don't know the total cost yet, but what we've put in the budget for 26-27. We've got a reduction in the rates contributors, which is impacting on the need for increased rates. And then across all our other budgets, we're actually looking at a rates reduction of 1.27%. So when all of those are washed through, that's where we end up with a proposed rate increase.
Any comments, questions on that? Oh, hang on. We have got Councillor Moffat.
So what does reduction in rates contributors mean? Is that the number of rateable units? What does that mean?
No, so the rates contributors was, as Helen mentioned in her spiel, that's the dividends, interest, things that offset rates, the general revenue that comes in not at an activity level, and it offsets the need for rates. So our language is that that's a rates contributor because it contributes to the rates level. So think particularly dividends and interest.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. Just the trans waste dividend is 146,000 down. Do we know that it's going to be? Is there a reason for that? It's normally reasonably consistent.
The value that we've put in for the dividend is based off the latest advice that we've received from the provider, so they give us anticipated amounts that's then updated as we work through time and know what it will be. So it's just a reflection of the most up-to-date information that we have.
Richard,
Sorry,
did you?
can I just-
Oh, sorry.
So our annual plan was for 25-26 was 545. Was that our actual as well, or was it more in line with what you've budgeted for the next one?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but we can go and find that out.
Councillor Cameron.
When I'm looking at debt servicing, am I allowed to discuss this? A debt servicing for Second Ashburton Bridge, it's on my page 1.1 key variances. Is that appropriate time to bring that up, or do you want me to wait?
Yep, we can.
Yeah. When we look at that, we've got a percent of weighting, we've 572,000 this coming year. That presumably is on the money that we've already spent of the 7 million budget. Is that correct, that we had to set aside, or how's?
That amount of debt servicing is for 4.9 million that is budgeted in this current annual plan, so 2026. So that is a principal repayment and interest costs on 4.9 million. And then in the 2027 budget, we've budgeted 20 million. So that covers the interest cost for 6 months on 20 million.
Have we budgeted 7 million? Has that gone through the process? I don't recall.
We've had 7.5 million in the budget.
Yeah, I knew we had 7.5.
Yeah, and there was 4.9 left in this year because of expenditure in the previous year.
Okay, so we've drawn that down and we've spent that and we've repaying that.
Yeah,
that
and
rate.
the bigger point is the 20 million.
Yeah.
And that's the number that NZTA have suggested is a sensible provision for this budget
Okay,
year.
so we didn't actually, yeah, okay, got you. Thank you. So we'll worry about that when that comes up.
Well, 6 months, that is.
Obviously,
Well, we're not going to raise the 20 million on the
No.
1st of July. So it's just an assessment of raising that
Yeah.
debt by the 30th of June and what was the likely profile of that to have a sensible estimate for
yeah, got you. Yep.
debt servicing.
Councillor Wilson.
You've asked us to comment on those numbers there. So how do I comment if I look at road and council funding? It's that, you know, do I find in here a page that splits it up, breaks it down, so then I can make an educated comment? Because that means absolutely nothing. 1% if you've stopped funding something or if you depreciate. No, there's no I've got to find the background information to make a comment. So I can't comment on that until I've got the information in front of me, effectively.
Yeah, as I say, we're starting with a whole of council view. So this is the big things that are driving the 10.2% rate increase. But we've got every activity, including rating, to still go through. So what we've tried to do with this slide is you can see that what is part of the reason for an increase in rates is the new road for the second bridge, and that is driving about 1% of increase in rates just from that one project. This isn't trying to comment on the entire roading activity, which is coming up under the activity level budgets, which you're yet to get to. So all of it is trying to paint a picture so that at the end of this process you will have the knowledge as to what's happening at the activity level and what is driving the overall increase in rates as per this draft budget. And then when you've got all that information, and I accept completely that you haven't seen it prior to today, but when you've got all of that and you've had the explanation as to what it all means, that as we work through this over the coming period of time, you will be in a position to have informed commentary and make decisions.
Okay, this is a good summary because I think it just splits everything up and shows us where the rate increases are going to be, and I guess when or if rates capping comes up, we know that water won't be included in that. So yeah, good to have a summary and have it divided up. Right, we'll go on to the next slide.
So we've talked about the reduction in rates contributors in 25-26. So this current year's annual plan, we provided for $4.18 million worth of offset to the rates. So $4.18 million worth of funding from interest, dividends, reserve funds, so drawdown on reserves. Same exercise we've done for 26-27 for the annual plan. That's come out at $2.4 million out of those core things that we normally draw down on. We've looked at some additional funding to push into those rates contributors. They're not sitting in the miscellaneous activity at the moment, they're sitting in their home cost centres. So part of that is funding from the Glasgow leases. So the Glasgow lease in the property area generates a surplus year on year, and prior to this current year's budget, that funding was actually used to offset rates. So we're proposing a drawdown of that I'm just finding out.
It's in there, yeah.
$561,000, and also a surplus from the parking activity of $82,000. So those two amounts make the 643 that you can see on the slide. The rates contribution itself of the $2.4 million, that is on page 4, I think, of your whole of council document. Towards the bottom of that page, you can see the ACL dividend we propose at $1 million, Transways dividend $399, interest income at $407, a drawdown from the property reserve of $500,000 and some additional parking surplus there of $129,000. So that's how we get to the $2.4 million. There's some expenditure that also sits in the miscellaneous activity that comes off before that rates contribution goes out. That's $31,000. That takes the total rates contribution in the miscellaneous activity to 2.4 to offset the general rate, plus those two additional items that I've just spoke about, which is the Glasgow lease surplus and some additional parking surplus. That would take us to $3 million worth of reserve contributions. That $3 million in contrast to the 4.1 from the 2026 year is a reduction of $1.1 million to offset the general rate. The rates impact of that is 2.01%.
Councillor Cameron.
Thank you, thanks for that. I saw that. So are we firm on that ACL dividend of 1 million?
So this is a draft budget that we're presenting
Yeah.
to you. The dividend is a budgeted dividend from ACL.
So that's in our statement of, well, it's not in our statement of expectation, it's a statement of intent, is it? Is that the dividend level?
No, the dividend level is not stated specifically.
Can
in
we
the statement.
rely on that is my question, essentially.
Well, yes, and from the purposes of a budget, we think that is a reasonable number
good.
to allow.
Thank you. Do we have, like we don't have a lot now on forestry reserve and property reserves and stuff, so there's no contribution there. What is left in the Glasgow lease reserve? Is that would be a part of the property reserve, I'm
The
guessing?
Glasgow lease is part of the property reserve as a
Yeah.
whole.
Is there anything left in that when we take out that 600 and whatever? Or three, whatever it is in here?
561.
561 is the budgeted surplus for 2027, so it's not actually drawing down on the reserve, it's channeling the year's surplus into the rates.
Into the rates,
So
yeah.
essentially it's sustainable revenue that we're
Okay, so
drawing
it's
on.
ongoing. And I have one more question, if I may, with the AC of the reserves. No, that covers it all. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
I have full confidence in your numbers. I think they're well presented and they're good numbers there. If we go back 3 years, we had about, what was the contribution then? Just to put it in context, because saying it's 2% of rates, it's actually a drop of 30% from last year's contribution, because the contribution all goes into the UAGC, so it affects every person's UAGC. So if you're looking at home, it was $700, you take 30% of contribution off that, actually it's quite a significant amount. So just to put it in context, we were 4.1, we're looking at 3. The year before, what were we? Do you know those numbers off?
Not off the top of our head, but we can do some work while we're here and
Great,
come back to you with
because
that.
because this is quite significant for the average urban ratepayer, because this is what offsets your UAGC and your general rate and pays for the.
Sort of, because the UAGC in the end is struck because there's a legal maximum of 29.9 or 30% of your rates, other than targeted rates. So in the end, the UAGC is set by legislative maximum, not how we calculate it based on our own policies. If there was no legal maximum, our policies would dictate a higher UAGC than that maximum. So it's slightly more nuanced and complicated than just saying this is driving the UAGC.
So then my further question on that would be, is this all going to be put towards the UAGC, or will it be put to roading as some in the past has been, and it's allowed to be?
It almost doesn't matter, because we will set the UAGC as per council policy at the limit that you
I'll
advise us.
rephrase my question then. If will this be put towards the UAGC and general rate, or will some be put towards roading rate as well, as it's allowed to be?
Helen.
Yeah, so the process that we're working with, I mentioned about doing a system change, so the intent is to feed the rates contributor. You will see that coming through as a line against the activities that the revenue and financing policies states will receive the rates contributor. Roading isn't part of that. The rates contributor is specified as feeding into specific activities, so we were going to follow the revenue and financing policy.
Just on the Transwaste dividend, so has that been, I can't recall what it's been in the past, but has it slowly been sort of decreasing?
We're going to do that research for you. And
Yeah,
get
I
back to
think that would be good. Any other questions on that? Okay. So we're up to rates variances next, yep.
Just go back for a second, sorry. In terms of the question about what the rate contributor contributions were from prior years, so the 24-25 financial year, the rate contributor was 6.5 million, and for the 25-26 financial year, the rates contributor was 4.2 million. So it does vary year by year depending on the circumstances.
Thank you.
Cool. In Stella, on your document, if you head to page 5 and 6, you'll see two very intimidating looking pages full of numbers. But we will get Helen to explain them because this is actually a really interesting way of being able to assess where your pressures are sitting.
So the first table under 1.3 in the whole of council summary, what you've got down the left-hand side is essentially every activity, with a couple of exceptions that I'll talk to. And you've got 2026 numbers for the annual plan and 2027, which is the green highlighted with a variance. So what we're presenting to you here is what is the rate increase at an activity level. So year on year for each activity across council, what is that rates increase? Bear in mind that some of these activities have rates contributors feeding into them for 2026, and we've got it sitting all in miscellaneous for 2027. So if you jump to sort of 3/4 of the way down the page and see the miscellaneous line there, it's 3.537, and that's reflecting largely the rates contributors in there. With an offset that we've got above. It makes it a little bit complicated, but hopefully I can talk you through that. So I'll start at the top. You can see those core activities there. We've got waste, wastewater, water, stormwater, the debt servicing for the bridge, and the reduction in the rates contributors. We've just talked about those on one of the previous tables, and we said that that high level was an indicative rate increase of 11.47%. So that was one of the first tables that we showed you. So that's those core things. What rates increase does that give us? And then you may recall that we've said we've landed at a 10.2% rates increase. So how do we get to 10.2%? That's the rest of the activities that you see below in the rest of the list. So, for example, the airport, annual plan 2026 was a rate requirement of 63. I'll pick a better one, actually. I'll do one that will demonstrate it a little bit more. I'm looking for EA Networks.
I've just got a question from Councillor Cameron.
Thanks. I was just going to ask a question, probably Britta's thinking. The other activity variances, they are lower, like they're saving, if you like. It's how we get to 10.2. How have these savings been, or were they already in plan to be costing less? Or, like example, Ashburton Airport, annual plan.
So there's two things to
that's a
answer
bad
that. So
example,
there's unders and overs.
Yeah.
But one of the things you have to take into account is the comment that Helen just made in relation to the rates contributors, which are all sitting inside the miscellaneous category. And so in the previous year, some of those activities had the rates contributors directly recorded against them, and they haven't this year. So those increases, until you get to the activity detail, aren't absolutely like for like. And so if you see in the middle, as Helen pointed out, miscellaneous, there's a 6% reduction because that's where the contributors are sitting. So this is a helpful table, I think, to show you the mathematical jump from the big rock increases, the 11.47, to the overall increase of 10.2, but you're not completely comparing apple with apples through those activities and the rates impact that this draft budget shows, because those contributors are not treated in the same way.
Is this the whole, where we've got the total rate requirement of 10.2, is this the whole of council activity at a higher level? So this will include any salary increases, any new staff,
Absolutely.
any legislation stuff
Everything.
around?
Everything.
Yep.
Everything?
Everything.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. Just getting my head around the start of the day, and we were working to all areas having a sort of a zero increase budget. And I'm just looking at rural beautification and urban beautification, and between the two of them, there's an $850,000 increase. That doesn't feel like a zero budget to
No.
me, that's all.
I think let me walk you through an example and
Okay.
it will really help you understand the difference, and that's the two tables that we're presenting. If we look at EA Network Centre, so just slightly below halfway down the page, so table 1.3, you can see the rate requirement for 2026 is 3.528 million. Everyone got that?
Yep.
We look at the rate requirement for 2027, 4.460. And you're thinking, wow, that's a $932,000 increase. What's Sarah doing in that activity? What's she spending that money on? That's 1.66% being added back onto the rate. Okay. The figure that you've got there for 2026 has got rates contributors in there. The figure for 2027 doesn't have rates contributors in there. I'm going to jump you over to the next page, and I know I'm jumping, but we can come back to the higher level, but I think it's a good illustration. So go to...
There's a couple of questions, sorry. We'll
It probably,
uh,
it probably goes before it. The first activity level, wastewater, drinking water, stormwater, second bridge and reduction in rates contribution. Those numbers there, it's 30% change. And if I look at most of those are targeted rates, which we don't put a rates contribution to. So if we look at the best one to look at is the very first one, waste collection, waste management. It's gone from 3.8 to 6.3, and we don't have any rates contribution, which is about nearly a 100% increase, which that is driving rates to the public in a true sense. It's not, if you put it over everything, that's fine, but it's actually a direct cost being loaded onto people who get wastewater and people who get rubbish. So I think that's one to focus on. 4.5 is not, it's a general thing, but for the targeted rate people, it's an increase in their rubbish by quite a significant amount.
Yes, that's true. What we're trying to do at this level of the presentation and this overall council level is explain to you the 10.2%, because that's the overall rate increase from this draft budget. So how does it get to 10.2? Well, it's made up of these things. But you're right, the individual rate, where it's a targeted rate on a different group of ratepayers than the whole group, is a different level of increase for that service and that ratepayer. We're not trying to say that's the increase for that service. We're trying to explain the overall increase in rates. When we get to the activity level, you'll see the impact more clearly.
okay, sorry, we'll go back to you, Helen, and you can go through.
So table
This again.
1.4,
Yep.
what we've done is we've stripped out the rates contributor for 2026. So what you're looking at is the core activity costs without it being blurred by that rates contribution, which is artificially lowering the rate requirement for that activity. So this one is your apples with apples, without that 2% rates impact from not having the same amount of rates contribution. So if we look at EA Networks here, the funding requirement, so with the rate requirement without any supplement from the rates contributor for 2026 was $4.2 million. And if we're looking at the annual plan for 2027, it's $4.4 million. So both of those figures don't have any rates contributors in them. So the real rate increase for the operational activity there is $175,000, which is 0.31% on the rates, as opposed to the table